So hi, welcome to this video. In our previous video, we were able to create our handler module, right? So now in this video, we are going to be working on the second phase of practicing this concept, and I'm going to work with the analytics module. So first of all, I'm going in with the data processing. That is the classes that we are going to be using to load, filter, and clean our data, right? So the first class that we are going to be creating is for loading our data, right? So we know how we were able to load our data frames when we were working with pandas, and then how we were able to filter our data with pandas, and also how to clean up our data with panda. So for this module, we are going to be importing two major things, and that is pandas. So we already have pandas installed in this workspace. So I'm going to import pandas, and I'm also going to import the typing library. So I'm going to say from typing. So from this typing, I'm going to import something called callable, okay? Because we are going to be using functions on some of our data. Then I'm also going to import optional. Now, I'm going to move ahead with creating our classes. And the first class that I'm going to create is the data loader. So I'm going to call it data loader, and we are not inheriting from anyone. So here we are going to define our init function, and we are going to pass in the source of the file. So I'm going to just pass in source, and I'm going to use type hinting and say that I want this to be a string. All right. So here I'm going to say that self.source is going to be our source. All right. But then I'm going to save this as a protected class attribute. And for that, I'm going to create a getter and a setter function. So I'm going to call the property decorator, and I'm going to define my getter. So this is my getter function, and I'm going to call it source. And here I'm going to pass in self, and I'm expecting this to return a string, and then I'm closing the function header. So of course, here the only thing we are doing is to return self dot underscore source. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is to create the method that will load the data. So I'm going to call it loader, and I'm going to pass in self. So now I'm going to tell Python that I'm expecting a data frame to be returned. So I'm just going to say that I want pandas dot data frame to be returned, right? So but right now we know that typing in pandas at all times will give us issues or might not be too convenient. So I'm just going to say as pd, and here I'm going to change this to pd.data frame. Okay, so I'm going to close this function header, and I'm going to give a little space between these two functions. So the next I'm going to do is I'm going to check for the type of file that is being passed in. So I'm going to say that if self.source, and we are going to call the dot lower so that it will convert it to lower case, whether it is in lower case originally or not. And we are going to get the ends with method. Okay, this is another string method. So we are saying that if this ends with .csv, so we are going to pass in a string, and I'm going to pass in .csv. So if it ends with .csv, then it means that the file that we are interacting with is a CSV file. So then if this ends with .csv, then we are going to return pd.readcsv, right? So I'm sure we are familiar with this function, and the file that we are going to be reading is that string, right? So we are going to pass in self.source as our string, right? Now then we are going to check if it is a JSON file. So we are going to do it on this elif block, and we are going to check for self.source again, dot lower, dot end, okay, dot ends with. So we are going to pass in dot JSON. Okay, so If this is true, then what are we going to do? We are going to return pd dot read JSON. All right, so you can use pandas to read JSON as well, right? And we will now pass in the source as the source of the file. So if none of these two conditions are met, then it means it's neither a JSON file nor a CSV file. So I'm going to write my else block. So I'm just going to raise an error, and that error is going to be a value error. So in here, I'm going to just pass in a string, unsupported file format. Now, this is our loader class. So the next class that we are going to create is our filter class, and I'm going to call it filter. So this class will be able to use some certain conditions to filter our data. So we are going to apply a lambda function and use it to filter our data. Okay, so here I'm going to define my init for this class, and apart from self, we are also going to pass in a function. So I can call it function, and we want it to be of type callable. So a function is something that is callable. So and it's going to be called on a data frame. So here I'm going to pass in pd dot data frame, and okay, and out here I'm going to write something else. So I'm going to write comma, and here I'm going to write, well, pd dot series. So we are going to return a series, right? A data frame series that is going to have true or false, just a series of Boolean data that is going to be applied on all the members of the data frame. So if they meet the filter condition, then it is true, and then if it meets the opposite, then it is false, right? So the next thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to set the instance attribute for function. So I'm going to call it self dot function should be the value of that function. So but here again, we're making it a protected class attribute, right? So now I'm going to define my apply function. So I'm going to define it, and I'll call it apply, and then I'm going to open and close my parentheses and pass in self, then pass in a data frame, and that data frame is going to be, well, of type data frame. So pd dot data frame. Then here I'm going to write my arrow for the return statement. So after you apply this function, also return a data frame. So here again we have pd dot data frame, and we are going to create another variable called mask. So I am going to set it to this, that this function should be applied on this data frame, and then we now returned the masked version of the data frame. Okay, so I'm going to say self dot function, right? And I'm going to open and close this and pass in a data frame. Then I'm going to return data frame, the data frame that is masked. So the next class that I'm going to create is the cleaner class. So I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to create another class, and I'm going to call it cleaner, right? And we all know what it means to clean data. So we are going to be checking for null values, probably filling null values with default figures. So first of all, I'm going to define my init function. So defining underscore underscore init, and inside this init function, I will specify that I'm expecting a data frame. That is the data frame that will be cleaned, and the type, well, we are going to use optional. So, and this is simply saying that you doesn't have to be strict on the incoming data. And I'm going to write pd dot data frame, right? So I am saying that this data frame is none. So there is a data frame here already, but it's none. So any other data frame that will be passed in will now become the data frame. I hope this makes sense, right? Now, the next thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to create the instance attribute, right? So, and I'm going to say that self dot, so we have our underscore data frame, just like we have been doing it before, is going to be the data frame that will be passed. Okay, so here I'm going to use another form of encapsulation to return the data frame. So instead of the property getter, and I'm going to just define a function, and I'll call it set underscore data frame. So here I'll open and close my parentheses, pass in self, and pass in df, and it should be a data frame. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to self set the data frame, okay, to now become the data frame that is passed in here. All right, so I'm going to say now that self dot data frame will now be the data frame that is passed in this function. All right, so now I'm going to set it to df, and then return self. All right, so this we just set the data frame and hold it, right? So the next method we are going to create is a data cleaning method. So, and this method is going to drop null rows. All right, so I'm going to say define drop null underscore rows. Okay, and then I'll pass in self, and then I'll return this class again, right? So here again, I'm returning this class. So I'm going to close this function header, and I'm going to enclose this in single quotes, right? Okay, so I'm going to enclose both of them in single quotes. Now let's move on with creating our methods. So now here I'm going to complete this, and I'm going to say that self dot data frame is equal to self dot data frame dot drop na, and then we return self. So go ahead to create the fill null function, and that is going to fill null value with the value that we are going to pass in. So I'm going to define another function, and I'm going to call it fill null, and then I'll pass in self and pass in value. Okay, and again I'm returning this class. So I am going to pass in the data frame dot underscore df will now be set to this dot fill null value, and then I'll pass in the value. Okay, and then return self. So the next one I'm going to create is to convert the data frame to a dictionary. So I'm going to define it, and then pass in self, then the data type I will pass it in. I'll pass in as a dictionary, and out here I'm going to return the class, and again our self dot data frame will now be set to self dot data frame dot as type, then we pass in the data type that we want, and then return self. So the last one we are going to create is to get the data frame itself. All right, so we are going to define it, and we are going to call it get data frame. Then we are going to pass in self, and we are going to return cleaner, and we are only just returning the cleaned data frame. Okay, so we've been able to create all our cleaning methods. So with this, we are done with our processing module, and the next module we are going to be creating, or we are going to be writing, is the grouping module. All right, so thank you so much for watching this video. I will see you in the next one.